Hello, my name's Chris, and today I'm taking a look at another of Canon's older lenses, a really old one this time, the Canon 35mm f2. This was released way back in 1990, back in the days of film cameras, as well as Margaret Thatcher and the rave scene, so it will work on full-frame digital cameras as well as APS-C. It was recently discontinued and replaced by the more expensive Canon 35mm f2 IS-USM, which I reviewed a little while ago. But this original lens can still be found on eBay for about £200, give or take, which is quite cheap. 35mm is a classic general-purpose focal length on a full-frame camera. It's wide angle enough for you to catch the bigger picture, but zoomed in enough to get a little emphasis on your subject. As a result, it's quite a versatile focal length for all kinds of uses, especially for street photography. Personally, at the moment, it's my favourite focal length. However, if you're using an APS-C camera, then your camera's cropped sensor will give you a more zoomed in field of view, the equivalent of about 56mm. So, on an APS-C camera, the lens behaves more like a standard lens, giving you a stronger emphasis on your subject and a more compressed background, rather than a wide field of view. That's also quite a useful and popular focal length, so the lens could be very valuable to you, whatever camera you have. Also, the lens has quite a fast maximum aperture of f2, which means it can let in quite a lot of light. Not quite as much light as f1.8, and only half the light of f1.4, but still quite a lot of light. So it's very useful for indoor or nighttime photography. The fast f2 aperture also means that you can get quite an out-of-focus background. For example, here's a picture taken at f4.5, the maximum aperture of a typical kit lens at 35mm, and here's the same picture taken at f2. It's a very nice difference. Its main design drawback, though, is that it's a bit too old to have image stabilization. Well, let's look at its build quality. Its design is pretty old-fashioned to look at, especially with that really thin focus ring. But actually, the lens feels very solid and weighty. It feels like a good quality product in your hand, even having a metal lens mount. It's a very small lens too, which is nice. The manual focus ring turns quite precisely with hard stops at either end, but you can feel gears moving as it turns, so it's not the smoothest mechanism. The front lens element does not turn as you change focus, and the lens does not have full-time manual focusing, but if you switch the lens to autofocus, then a clutched design means that you can safely turn the focus ring without the focus motor being forced around. It's actually quite a good design. The autofocus motor is super fast, but as you can hear, it does make quite an audible buzzing noise as it goes. Sounds just like a Dalek. All in all, the lens looks a bit cheap and nasty, but it's actually really solid and it works nicely in practice, handling quite well, even if the autofocus is a little noisy. Okay, let's look at image quality. I'll start by testing it on a full-frame camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. I've turned on chromatic aberration and vignetting correction for this test. With the aperture wide open at f2, the lens is quite sharp in the middle of the image with slightly low contrast levels. The corners are also quite sharp with no visible chromatic aberration, although the extreme corners of the image are very blurred indeed. Stop down to f2.8 for more sharpness and contrast, and even more again at f4, and when you finally stop down to f8, even those extreme corners are finally sharp. Back in the middle of the image, everything is still nice and rosy. So on a full-frame camera, the lens performs fairly well. It's quite sharp, except for those extreme corners. Let's take a look now at how it performs on a more typical APS-C camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 70D. I've also used vignetting and chromatic aberration correction in this test. Right, With the aperture wide open at f2, the lens is fairly sharp in the middle of the image, again with slightly low contrast, and if we look in this window, we can see a little purple fringing. It's not too bad though, you're getting quite a usable image. Image quality in the corners is also acceptably sharp, with little visible chromatic aberration. The colours and contrast really do look a bit washed out though. Stop the lens down to f2.8 and the corners look a lot stronger, and the picture quality in the middle of the image becomes very nice and sharp with great contrast levels. Stop the lens down to f4 and the picture quality becomes perfect in the middle, although the edges of the image might need just a little more persuasion. Stop down to f5.6 and then finally to f8 for really good image quality in the corners. So on an APS-C camera, the lens performs averagely well. You're getting a usable picture at f2 and sharp image quality when you stop down the lens's aperture. It's not an impressive performance, but it's good. Okay, time for the obligatory vignetting and distortion test. They're not really a problem on an APS-C camera, so let's see how the lens performs on a full frame camera. Firstly, the good news is that the lens shows only a little barrel distortion, so that's good to see. However, at f2 the corners of its images are really dark. That is some very strong vignetting. You can use peripheral illumination on your camera to get rid of it, or stop the lens down to f2.8 for a bit more brightness in those corners, and at f4 the vignetting is gone. So it's a good performance for distortion, but a fairly weak performance for vignetting. The lens can focus down to 25 cm, which is good enough for this kind of lens. The close-up image quality is fairly sharp at f2 and very nice from f2.8. That's not a bad performance. The lens struggles a little with working against bright lights, with a fair bit of flaring popping up. That is typical for an older lens design. Let's see how the lens can handle coma. Coma is when bright points of light in your picture become smudged, typically at wider lens apertures. On this Canon lens, there's some quite noticeable coma in the edges of the picture at f2. This is not good, but I've seen worse before. Stop the lens down to f2.8 and it's mostly cleared up. That's annoying for shooting at night time though. Finally, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh, or the quality of the lens's out of focus areas. As you can see in this picture, the out of focus highlights look quite rough and ready and a little distracting. It's a real shame this lens doesn't have smoother quality bokeh, although, like with the coma levels, I have seen worse. Well, what can we say overall? The Canon 35mm f2 is an old design now, but it's good value. It handles nicely, and it still gives a good optical performance in a lot of areas. It's fairly sharp with low chromatic aberration, and it has low distortion. It's pretty average in most other areas though, and it's a shame about the slightly weak bokeh. But on the whole, it's still a relevant camera lens for today. So if you're on a budget and you want a nice little 35mm lens for your kit bag, then this might be a very good choice for you. Nice little lens.